Well, it was 2 weeks ago that I set out on a drive to a particular spot in northwest Adams County. No buildings in sight and no noise from the highway. There's nothing that stands out about this secluded location, except for the fact that it was this very spot where a group of mushroom hunters stumbled upon one of the tri-state's biggest mysteries nearly 30 years ago. We should warn you, some of the images you are about to see are graphic.
I was in the office and we got a call from the sheriff's office
requesting assistance with a potential body that had been found at an abandoned rock quarry.
Larry Hood and Mike Ernst still recall every detail of that day, the day when a mushroom hunter's discovery opened the case, a case unlike anything Ernst had seen before or since.
We found this body and it was what we called mummified.
Just southwest of Lima, the body of a white male in his 20s had gone undiscovered for months in the bushes next to this lake. Preserved by the winter's cold, then withered by the spring sun, his skin was literally blackened. Larry Hood christened the subject Marvin the Mummy, and it was clear from the beginning, Marvin was murdered.
The decedent had undergone a massive amount of trauma to certain areas all over his body.
Despite the trauma, investigators had a good place to start. A t-shirt from a restaurant in Panama City Beach, Florida, a complete set of fingerprints, and one signature clue.
It was also of particular interest that we were able to discover a tattoo on his right forearm.
According to Larry Hood, a tattoo most likely inked in a prison, one that you don't forget once you see it.
I felt good about the case as far as identification. I thought, this guy's going to be identified really soon. Well, as it turned out, that wasn't the case.
Based on all the fingerprints and the clothing and the description and the tattoo, we attempted to identify this subject, which we were never able to do.
And things just aren't adding up.
Larry Hood and his colleagues searched thousands of fingerprint records.
The criminal and the military and the civilian files, all three were searched at the FBI with negative results.
And pretty soon, weeks of investigation turned to months, then to years, and eventually decades. Still, nothing.
It was the only case I'd ever seen where we could not identify the body.
How rare is a case like this? I mean, just talk about the absurdity of this exact circumstance.
Well, let's just put it this way. There has been one case like that. It's this one.
And today, almost 30 years later, you can sense the frustration from those who were there.
And I worked on it for 5 years before I retired. We put in a lot of hours.
I just kept saying in the back of my mind, someone is going to run into someone where someday that knows something about this case.
Now, as it turns out, Larry Hood was right. Somebody out there, one person, did know something about Marvin. And pretty soon, thousands more will be introduced to his mystery. That's tomorrow night on KHQA News at 10 in Part 2 of Marvin the Mummy Revisited. Adams County investigators spent decades trying to answer the question, who killed Marvin the Mummy? Here's what they knew. A man was murdered and his body was found in a secluded spot in northwest Adams County all the way back in 1985. That was it. They didn't know his name. They didn't know who killed him. They had no answers. But there's one thing you'll learn from criminal investigators. Until it's solved, a case is never closed. Thousands of hours of investigation, dozens of leads, zero answers for 23 years. Until that one day.
I was sitting at my desk here minding my own business, and I get a phone call from Sheriff's Department investigators in Mississippi.
They were calling about a man they had in custody on a forgery charge, but as it turns out, This man liked to talk.
He started running his mouth for one reason or another.
The man gave details of the murder, including a description of the signature clue.
He proceeded to describe this tattoo to a T, details that left no question whatsoever, but that he was the one who killed Marvin the Mummy.
The man behind those details was Wallace Spence. Here's what he told investigators. Spence and the victim were driving through Edmonson County, Kentucky on a petty crime spree. The victim made an unwanted sexual advance towards Spence. Spence struck the victim in the chest with a lead-filled baseball bat, then drove over him twice with his car.
Struck him full on at about 40 miles an hour, and according to Spence, he knocked him right out of his shoes.
He then put the victim in the trunk and drove over 400 miles to the rock quarry in northwest Adams County to dump the body. Finally, investigators had their suspect. But what about the victim? Who was Marvin the Mummy, and why wasn't he ever identified?
They contacted the Florida Department of Corrections, and sure enough, our victim had been in prison. He had been fingerprinted, but his file had somehow slipped through the cracks and had not been entered into the system.
It all came down to a procedural error that left the mummy unidentified until 2008. 23 years after the discovery, investigators learned the name of the man in the quarry, Thomas Brannon, a man who had done time with Wallace Spence in Florida.
Neither had any connection to the Quincy area, and there was really no way we could have ever solved the case without him confessing.
Closure was huge, particularly for law enforcement here in Adams County. I can speak for, because they worked so hard on it.
It makes me feel good because I did my job. I defy anyone to criticize my work on this case, because it was right and right on the money.
So, why even bring this up 6 years after the case was closed? Because it's about to get the spotlight from a national TV network. A crew from the Investigation Discovery, or ID Network, was in town recently to cover the story. They spoke to the same people you heard from here tonight, and it's all going to be featured on a new show called Murder Book. Now, an entire episode will be dedicated to Marvin the Mummy, and we haven't been told an exact air date yet, but it is in production right now and will air sometime early next year. One final note, there is so much more to this story that I wasn't able to touch on these last 2 nights because of time constraints. Some believe Wallace Spence didn't act alone, and that maybe there's somebody else out there, perhaps somebody local, who was involved in hiding the body. Also, was Wallace Spence lying about the motive to kill Thomas Brannon? It's very possible, given what he did in the years after the killing. That's all covered in an extended online version of tonight's story. You can find that in just a little bit later tonight on KHQA.com. Now, in case you're wondering, Wallace Spence is currently serving a 1-year prison sentence in Kentucky. He's eligible to be released next month.